I guess I'll start out by saying that originally I was supposed to give a presentation like this for the evangelism thing that we were going to do a couple years ago, but ended up getting canceled. I was asked to talk about this particular topic, looking back in history as to what our forefathers had done for bringing the Missouri Synod into North Dakota, but of course that conference fell through. But my interest in the subject didn't go away. And so I continued to research what had happened and been trying to find out as much information as I can. I have joked with some of you that you might feel rather, well, lazy hearing about what our forefathers did back in even with their challenges. But I do want to say that I'm not really trying to discourage anybody with this presentation. I really do think that we can gain something from considering what our forefathers went through and the zeal which they had to encourage us to continue our own calling and to deal with all of those things too. So, I mean, if God has blessed the prophets, he can certainly also bless the prophets' sons. I do want to give one quick thank you to Concordia Historical Institute, who has been very helpful for getting information. I also want to give thank you to the ELCA archives in Chicago, because they have also been very helpful for getting information, as well as all of the various congregations that I've been working with over the past couple of years, getting information from them, getting records, and all that sort of thing. This presentation would not be possible without them. I should also note that some of the pictures which you will see today are from CHI, but I can't remember which ones, so you'll just have to take my word for it. A few things I want to state at the beginning of my presentation. First of all, I am not covering the entire history of the North Dakota district. Maybe that comes as a disappointment to some. I don't know. I am only talking about the very earliest days, because if I tried to cover absolutely everything, there's no way I'd get through all of it in time. So I'm going to focus on the first 40 years of the LCMS in North Dakota, which will bring us down to the year 1910. That was the year when the North Dakota Montana district was formed, or the district right before this one was formed in 1946. And yet I think you'll see that even despite that relatively short period of time, it's a flurry of activity. In fact, I'm not even going to be able to talk about it all. Second thing I want to say is that I'm not going to be able to present a complete picture. My research is not yet complete, and I'm still gaining more from learning about this time period. So there are some holes in my study, but I'll do the best that I can. Third thing I want to note is that I want to lean towards stories as often as I am able to do. I mean, names and dates and locations are important, and I want to be as specific as I can with all of this, but I think the stories are more instructive. The fourth thing I want to say is I've probably made mistakes here or there. I mean, I'm trying to juggle information about more than 200 places in North Dakota, as well as more than 100 individuals. And that can be challenging, to say the least. And I'm not from North Dakota, so if I mispronounce a name, a place name, please be gentle.
No.
No. Now I'm going to mess up, especially around Verona. The fifth thing that I want to say before I get started is, however, before arguing that I've made a mistake about some information that you see here, please do realize that I've had to balance lots of different sources, sometimes which contradict with one another. Sometimes a congregation will say that a pastor was there like 3 years before he was ordained or something like that. Obviously, I had to make choices, and sometimes I went against the congregation, sometimes I went against the synod. But I have reasons for my choices, and if you want to know what they are, you can ask why at the end. Okay? All right. So, the best place to begin when talking about the Missouri Synod in North Dakota is to go back to the beginning, well, of the Missouri Synod. The Missouri Synod, or at least what we now call the Missouri Synod, was organized April 26, 1847 in Chicago. And the original 12 pastors and their congregations grew rapidly. so that by the 8th Synodical Convention, which was June 21st to July 1st in 1854, held in St. Louis, they resolved to divide the Synod into the 4 original districts, which you can see behind on this picture here. You have the Western District, the Central District, the Eastern District, and of course, the Northern District, comprised of Wisconsin and Michigan. And it is the Northern District that we are going to follow, because that's where our story goes along. As I said, the Northern District originally comprised of congregations in Michigan and Wisconsin. But soon after this district was formed, they started to make excursions into what was then Minnesota Territory. So that in 1856, 2 years after the formation of the district, Ferdinand Sievers, who you can see a picture of behind me here, made the first mission trip into Minnesota Territory. It was primarily to the Indians that were living there at the time, but he was also seeking out whatever Germans he was able to find. Now, I would like to include a short excerpt from Sievers' report from his trip, but I want to show you a quick map here of his trip. I don't have a lot of maps, but this one I think is pretty helpful, and it kind of can be hard to see, but all along the river here and also along here is all the places that he went. And you can see that that is not a small trip by any stretch of the imagination. This was before railroads, this was before roads. They were barely settled at this time. This was wilderness that he was traveling through, and he basically carried everything that he needed on his own back to make this trip.
Would that St. Columba be around Brainerd?
Which one are you looking at here?
1 and 2.
Yeah, 1 and 2. Yeah, I think that would be probably the Brainerd area. Yeah. Let me read a little bit from Sievers himself. This is what he says. I attempted to begin my mission operations in St. Cloud, about 70 miles north of St. Paul on the Mississippi River, after my return from St. Columbo. Because of the beautiful location and rapid growth of St. Cloud, I had hoped to find some Lutheran brethren of the faith there. But I was disappointed, inasmuch as part of the city was occupied by Americans and the other part exclusively by Roman Catholic Germans. Hence, I journeyed on down the Mississippi, and on the next day arrived in the 2 villages, St. Anthony Falls and Minneapolis. Imagine saying that today. Situated opposite each other 9 miles above St. Paul on the shores of the Mississippi, and joined by a solid chain bridge. As impossible as it was for me to see any prospects of establishing a Lutheran congregation among the numerous Lutherans of St. Anthony Falls, so delightful it was for me to make the acquaintance of a small group of Lutherans in the opposite village of Minneapolis, who hailed my coming with gladness and utilized it to effect the organization of a Lutheran congregation. So already here in 1856, with this initial trip, you can see the joys and the frustrations that these early missionaries faced. I mean, I could spend this whole presentation talking about mission work in Minnesota, obviously, and it would be its own presentation. But I want to focus on North Dakota. And so I want to also focus on the movements in Minnesota which are headed that way, especially for the Reiseprediger, as they were called, who were going towards North Dakota. Now, I am going to use that term quite a bit, so I want to explain what it means real quick. Reiseprediger is the German term that the Synod used for these men. Reise means travel. Prediger means preacher. And it can also be singular or plural. So a Reiseprediger is literally a traveling preacher. Now, we often refer to them as circuit riders, which is just fine, but it's actually technically a borrowed term from the Methodists. So I prefer to use the term that the Synod used for these men for many years. So the Reiseprediger. And so with that in mind, then, I'm going to jump forward in time to an important Reiseprediger in 1872, a man by the name of Reverend Henry Feter. You can see him in his lovely buffalo skin coat here. Feter was born August 25th, 1842. And after his seminary education, he was ordained July 28th, 1872 in Wahpeton, Minnesota. And 2 days later, he had already set out on his mission. And I want to give you an idea of what his parish looked like. The counties: Wright, Meeker, Candioti, Stearns, Benton, Morrison, Todd, Becker, Ottertail, Douglas, Stevens, Pope, Big Stone, Swift, Chippewa, Renville, and Redwood. No less than 42 separate places over this enormous swath of Minnesota. Now, I don't have any evidence that Feter ever crossed the Red River into North Dakota. I mean, he might have, but I think he had enough to do without ever getting into North Dakota. Now, let me give a short excerpt from Feter himself regarding some of his struggles. So he's talking about his work around St. Cloud. And I'm going to go back to him so you can see his picture here while I read from him. So Feter writes, "Owing to the lack of a church, and with the spasmodic service I can give this congregation because of my journeyings, it was quite difficult to successfully ward off the fanatics who offer their churches to them freely. Throughout the year, the Pharisaic Albright brethren are active during my protracted absence to gain the few Lutherans for themselves. But the Lord graciously watched over his flock so that our people became aware of the cunning and falsehood of the enemy, and their deceptive arts proved vain. And also for other reasons, I have high hopes for St. Cloud. For not far from the village, there are several small clusters of farmers, most of whom are staunch Lutherans, and as such have the anxious desire to join with the small St. Cloud congregation in the future. Would God bestow good crops, there would soon be a church in St. Cloud." The Albright brethren that Feter refers to were a group of German-speaking Methodists who often sent out circuit riders in large numbers, especially into territorial Minnesota as well as the Dakotas. And these early men often talk about their struggles with these Methodists, some of whom were, well, not very honest, because they would present themselves as Lutherans and so deceive some of the people that they came to. But not all, of course, were so deceptive. But on more than one occasion, they beat Missouri into the field, so that, as Feter puts it, many places where there were many places where they would take over places where these Reiseprediger had already been, but there were also places where the laity held firm despite the long absences of their pastors. Okay? So, in August 1872, Feter made his initial journey into the area of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And he made the initial organization of the church there, which is now called Trinity, a church that's still there today. Feter came back as often as he could, but as you've already heard, it was often weeks in between. And so Feter called for more workers to help divide up his field. There were 3 at first, but the one that I want to focus on is this man, Reverend Robert Winkler. Born September 27th, 1847. Winkler studied in St. Louis, and after passing his examination, he was sent into Minnesota, and Feter ordained him in Fergus Falls, August 10th, 1873. So, Winkler did not have nearly such a large field as Feter did. Winkler focused primarily on Fergus Falls, Elizabeth to the north of Fergus Falls, Freiburg Township, which is kind of the northeast of Fergus Falls, as well as Perham further north. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Minnesota geography, but you at least get an idea. Winkler aimed to more thoroughly establish his congregations that he had so that a firm foothold would be established within the area. And God did bless his work because virtually all of the congregations that he established still exist today. But I suppose we finally need to get to North Dakota. Sometime in the fall of 1874, some settlers from the Great Bend area came over to Elizabeth. They were there to sell their crops, since there was a mill at Elizabeth. And while they were there, they came into contact with members of Trinity Fergus Falls, who brought them into contact with Winkler. and they asked him to come and to serve them. And so Robert Winkler then became the first Missouri Synod pastor to set foot in North Dakota, at least the first that can be proven. Winkler, of course, would come back to serve them as often as he could, and he was there when they formally organized in the spring of 1875. So Trinity Town Berlin is the oldest congregation of the district. And I say Town Berlin because technically it was originally, correct me on this if I'm wrong, Brock, it was originally south of Great Bend, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the church was originally south of Great Bend and eventually moved up into town.
Where the cemetery is now.
Oh, so it's not that far south then.
A little bit north, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So Trinity Great Bend then, or Trinity Town Berlin, is thus the oldest congregation of our district still in existence. But I say still in existence deliberately, because there's a large number of churches and places which simply no longer exist. Some never lasted very long. Some merged into others. Some left the synod for various reasons, and some closed after many years. And part of the difficulty of my work, of course, is tracking all of these down, especially those congregations that now only exist on paper. Sometimes the only evidence that I have of these early congregations is a number, that this pastor was serving this many congregations without telling me anything more than that. And so, at the very beginning of the North Dakota district, then, we have to go north to meet one of those congregations which are now long gone. We have to go up to the area of Hillsboro, where we will meet the other early congregation important for the foundation of the district. But to talk about that congregation, we have to first leave the Missouri Synod. We have to go to the Norwegians. Settle down, Paul. I don't have time to talk about the coming of the Norwegians to Minnesota. That would take forever. But I will talk about one very important man, and important not just for the history of our district. Bugh Anundsen Harstad was born December 17th, 1848 in Norway, and his family emigrated to America, where they finally settled in Minnesota. Harstad attended the fledgling Luther College in Iowa from 1865 to 1871. Do we have any Luther College graduates here? No? Where did you go? Didn't you go to Iowa? Brandon? No, you didn't? Okay. We don't care about Chris, so. But this was also the time of the original synodical conference. The predestinarian controversy had not yet torn it apart. And so the Norwegian Synod was then in fellowship with the Missouri Synod. So Harstad attended seminary at St. Louis in 1871 to 1874, where he studied at the feet of Walther himself. So it made him sympathetic to Missouri ever after. And after he passed his examination at St. Louis, Harstad was ordained in a group in Chicago, July 14th, 1874, and among those ordaining him that day was Herman Amberg Preuss. So, blame Paul. See, I told you there was a connection. Harstad was soon sent to the area around Mayville, where he was installed on October 1st, 1874, but he was a man who could not sit still. He would go on to plant and to establish a large number of congregations. Most of the Norwegian congregations in Traill County can trace their heritage back to him. Harstad also made an excursion over to the Mouse River, which means some of the Norwegian congregations in the Minot area also owe their foundation to him. He would later recount that he founded no less than 16 congregations, several of which still exist. But sometime late in the year of 1874, he came into contact with a group of Germans, the Bonsack family just east of Hillsboro, where the cemetery is today. Harstad was fluent in German because of his days at St. Louis, so he began to serve them, and they were organized June 3rd, 1875, as Emmanuel Hillsborough. Emmanuel Hillsborough was the mother church of St. John, our current one that's there in Hillsborough, and it was also the earliest congregation to affiliate with the Missouri Synod in 1890. Emmanuel would eventually merge into St. John in 1947, but that's a long ways in the future. Let me say just a few more things about Harstad since he's going to soon leave our story. One of Harstad's main focuses was education, no doubt to his time in Missouri. He would go on to establish what was known as Bruflat Academy near Mayville. And his emphasis on education would lead him to be called out west to Oregon, where he would be instrumental in founding what is now known as Pacific University, one of the universities of the ELCA today. However, when the Norwegian Synod merged with two others in 1917, Harstad was among those who did not go along with the merger. And so he separated along with some others, so that on June 14th, 1918, he was part of the group that formed the Norwegian Synod of the American Evangelical Lutheran Church, the so-called Little Norwegian, what we also know better today as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. One of the members of our later synodical conference, as well as the smaller group today in full fellowship with the Wells. Harstad served as its president until 1922, and he died June 20th, 1933. But let's go back to the Missouri Synod, shall we? In the wider synod about this time, the northern district was expanding. And because of the expansion, they sent a request to the synod to divide. And so at the 16th convention of the Synod, October 14th to the 23rd, 1874, in Fort Wayne, they passed the resolution to divide the Northern District. It was divided into two, as you can kind of see up here towards the top. Michigan and Ontario continued as the Northern District, and it would later be renamed the Michigan District, which it is today, which means that the North Dakota district is technically a daughter district of the Michigan district. Do with that what you will. Wisconsin and Minnesota separated to form a new district called the Northwestern, which you can see up here. And the Northwestern met for the first time on July 7th, 1875 in Watertown, Wisconsin. And in a report to that convention, they said an entirely new mission field has opened up for us in Dakota. Now, of course, they were talking about South Dakota, but it shows that their focus was turned ever more westward, especially as people began to settle in the Dakotas in ever-increasing numbers. So after organizing Trinity Town Berlin, Winkler would continue to serve them. But like Feter before him, his ever-increasing duties led to a need to divide the field. So a call went out and was answered. And now we're going to meet a very critical figure in the history of our district. Because if Harstad and Winkler were like Paul, laying the foundation of the district, well, then we now need to meet our Apollos, who watered widely. Johan Krueger. Born February 16th, 1852. And after passing his examination, Winkler ordained him November 19th, 1876 in Town Berlin, which means that he was the first Missouri pastor to be ordained in North Dakota. And I want to let him speak for himself regarding his initial experiences in North Dakota. This is what he says. In the first days of November 1876, I arrived in Elizabeth. I wanted to reach my congregation in Town Berlin, Dakota Territory. Pastor Winkler met me at Breckenridge and took me along to Freiburg, where he lived at the time. We stopped a few moments in Elizabeth at the mill, and it was getting dusk when we finally arrived in Freiburg. The parsonage was an old log cabin with one room and an attic. Both rooms had one thing in common. In each room there was a sort of bedstead that collapsed regularly every night. Someone had brought Pastor Winkler a bear ham, and of that we ate a generous steak. How would you like that to be your ordination meal? On the following Sunday, Pastor Winkler preached in Freiburg, while I preached for him in Fergus Falls and Elizabeth. Thus I preached my first sermon in my later beloved St. John's congregation, and on November 12, 1876. The next Sunday, November 19th, I was ordained by Pastor Winkler in town Berlin, in the presence of not quite a dozen congregation members. I lodged with a congregation member, G. Werner. The others brought some provisions, such as flour, potatoes, and I believe also meat. For this, Mr. Werner boarded me. That was my salary the first year. Once at a confirmation, Werner gave me $1 in cash. That was all the money I received in town Berlin in my first year. It was the second year of the grasshopper scourge, and the good people themselves barely had the most necessary things to eat and to live. Krueger would live in North Dakota until the following spring. Then Winkler received and accepted a call to Missouri. And so Krueger received a new call to serve Winkler's parish of Fergus Falls, Elizabeth, and Freiburg Township. And he accepted this call with the caveat that he would continue to serve town Berlin. And since the congregation agreed to that arrangement, they installed him April 2nd, 1877, and he was installed by Winkler before he left for Missouri. And I should say very quickly in passing, that was actually a very common thing in those days. A pastor would either ordain or install his successor. They usually did it on behalf of the DP, which is the way that they worded it at the time, who obviously couldn't be there. But that was the case almost all the time. And even when there was a vacancy, which did sometimes occur, but not always, I could usually assume that the one who does the actual ordaining or installing is also the one who served the vacancy at the time, although that was not always the case. But anyway, Krueger continued to serve this 4-point parish. And from here, he began to travel widely over the next few years. Now this, I will freely admit, this is one of these areas that I need to do a lot more work on. But I count no less than 19 places that Krueger established. And I'm not even sure I got them all over Minnesota, some places in North Dakota, and all the way up into Canada. The man could not sit still. I'll let Krueger tell you about it in his own words. The congregation at Elizabeth became a great blessing to a large part of the kingdom of God beyond its borders. It occasioned the founding of many preaching stations and congregations. It happened thus. In 1878, immigration into the Northwest began to increase. Masses of movers went through Elizabeth where I lived, which I personally saw or met on my trips between Elizabeth and Fergus Falls. This induced me to approach my good congregation in Elizabeth, whether we ought and could not do something to look up any brethren in the faith who might be among these movers, and to serve them with the means of grace. They had been in a similar predicament themselves only a short while ago, and other brethren in the faith had concerned themselves about them to the extent of sending them pastors and to provide for them spiritually. If the congregation were convinced it is the Lord Jesus' command to us, preach the gospel to every creature, and it were therefore our Christian duty to concern ourselves as much as possible with these brethren in the faith living nearest to us, then it could perhaps be arranged so that they would permit me to travel about for some time and ascertain whether and where fellow Christians were among these movers. The congregation gladly granted this permission and resolved to send me among these new settlers. And the 3 other congregations concurred in this resolution. And lo, the Lord attended our undertaking with his blessings, so soon we had quite a number of preaching stations. In the fall of 1877, I heard in Pelican Lake, 30 miles north of Elizabeth, where I ministered to 2 families, that in Detroit, Minnesota, 50 miles from Elizabeth, new German settlers had arrived. I visited these, and soon there was formed a nice little congregation, later on also another north of Detroit. That's technically Detroit Lakes today is what it's called. In the spring of 1878, many movers traveled through Elizabeth. I took the road and scoured the country for Lutherans. On this trip, I found Lutherans at Sabin, Moorhead, Fargo, Ada, Crookston, Fishers, Holly, and Pelican Lake. Then I returned home to Elizabeth. Later on, there were added Barnesville, Marston, and 2 places southwest of Fargo on the Cheyenne. Goose River, the present congregation at Hillsboro, North Dakota, and Clearwater. Then also Loon Lake, and finally also Town Western and Campbell. In 1880, I also traveled via Winnipeg to a place 60 miles from Winnipeg. There I organized a fine congregation. It immediately called a candidate, but in vain. Let me say just a couple things about what Krueger says here. First of all, he wrote these reports much later, and in another source, he admits that his memory is a bit fuzzy. He himself is not even really quite sure where he went and in what order he went. I might be able to untangle it, but it's going to take some more work. Second, he normally lists Fargo and Moorhead as two separate places. But I don't know if it was actually two separate stations or just one, and I have reason to think that it was just one. Third, the two places southwest of Fargo on the Cheyenne River, which he mentions, were later lost, and I don't know what became of them. Another source says that when we didn't have enough pastors, they basically went away for whatever reason. And lastly, he talks about Goose River, the present congregation at Hillsboro, by which he means Emmanuel Hillsboro. But the story, as he presents it, is a little bit more involved in the way he presents it. So I need to add some details. So Harstad continued to serve Emmanuel Hillsboro until sometime after June 1879. And at that point, he came into contact with Krueger. He then handed the congregation over to him. Harstad's own intense activities meant that he was stretched quite thin, and since it was a German congregation anyway, he was more than willing to give it to Krueger. And since he was very friendly towards the Missouri Synod, he knew that it would be well taken care of. So at an unknown date in late summer 1879, he gave it to him. However, Krueger was apparently not the first one to visit it. This is because a third figure now enters into our picture, one that's going to dominate the history of the LCMS in North Dakota until his death in 1930, Pt.1 Hink. Pt.1 was born January 17th, 1858. He studied at Springfield, and in September 1879, he was sent out as a student assistant for the better part of a year, what we might now call a vicar. I want to say a few things about students at this time, though. Yes, they mostly called them students, although sometimes they did also call them vicars. But vicars back then were not the same as vicars now. The vicarage program as we now know it would not come into existence for another 50 years. Students were just sent out from the seminary for varying lengths of time. Sometimes a few months, most of the time a year, sometimes 2 years. And they were sent out mostly as a kind of assistant in the field, especially in an area like this, which meant that most of the time students worked on their own. They were often employed as school teachers. And while they did preach sermons, they did not perform ministerial acts, at least as far as I can tell. Because I know of another story later on of a student who stepped outside of his boundaries and started acting like a pastor without a call, and he was reprimanded for it. It's telling me that Missouri was very careful about what these students could and could not do. But to make my job especially difficult, because why not, students were not well documented when they went out. Even the seminaries, all they would say is, gone. Not say where.
Did he leave the Synod?
That he had gone out on this vicarage. That's all they said. They didn't say where he went. They didn't say what he was doing. Sometimes not even for how long. Just gone. So if I know about students, it's because of congregational records. And sometimes they can be very difficult to find. So I have no doubt that there are some that have been lost to history. Pt.1 started his vicarage in September 1879. And he continued until June the following year. And it appears that Krueger sent his student to visit Emmanuel Hillsboro for the first time. Now, Vicar Hink, Pt.1, left an account of his first trip to Hillsboro. So I'm quoting now from a history book. Pastor Harstad's post office was Stony Point. On the way thither, student Hink arrived at the home of a farmer who likewise wanted to travel to Stony Point on the following day. With him, he remained overnight and slept soundly, knowing to be on the right road. The following morning, they drove out for Stony Point, the man with his single horse and the student with his ponies. But soon they had lost the trail on the prairie in the fog. The man steps off to search for a wagon trail and hands the students the lines of his horse. Pastor Hink describes the next events as follows. In order to do it right, the student gets out of his buggy, too, so that he can safely hold the horse entrusted to him. The horse looks around, spies the buffalo coat which the student was wearing because of the chilly weather, gets frightened, begins to run. The ponies, too. In the attempt to stop both teams, the student gets between them, is hurled to the ground, and forced to let everything run whither it will. Soon everything has disappeared in the fog. As a rule, the horses, including the ponies, have good horse sense, and these acted accordingly. The horse of the man turned about and ran home. But the ponies ran straight ahead into the world. The best the driver could do under the circumstances was to follow the trail of his team. In the dewy grass, this was not difficult. The fog gradually lifted, and the running of the ponies had also come to an end. In the near distance, we noticed a human habitation with a team standing there. The smart animals, running around in the fog and not knowing whither, discover a wagon trail and followed it. That was very sensible. Thus, the poor creatures need not run so far into the unknown world, and the student's heart was thereby eased considerably. He again had his so indispensable ponies. And so far, everything had passed off without any mishap. Only the whip had disappeared. The poor creatures could not be blamed for too much for letting that go. Hink continued to help Krueger before he went to the seminary back to the seminary in the summer of 1880. And now, in a pattern which has become familiar to us, after Hink left, Krueger's large field was divided, at least into two parts. And the first one that we see here is a man by the name of Charles Engel. Born March 31st, 1858, he was ordained by Krueger on September 5th, 1880, near Fisher, Minnesota. And Engel took over the northern part of Krueger's field, especially in Minnesota, places like Ada, Fisher, and Crookston. Engel was also the second pastor to serve Emmanuel Hillsborough. Engel would also be the one who would organize St. John Hillsborough sometime in the year 1881. Now, as a personal note, Engel was known for having a healthy appetite. But he probably always needed it because he was always on the move, serving the areas in Canada where Krueger had gone, because he was closer to them, but he wasn't that much closer. And he would continue to serve all over that part of Minnesota, as well as the two Hillsborough congregations until 1882. Krueger's southern field also divided, and he ordained his successor, Robert Kaler. Kaler was born February 8th, 1858. When he was a young man, maybe even a boy, he had emigrated to Australia. And while he was there, he discovered some literature from the Missouri Synod calling for pastors. So he took it up and emigrated back to America. And he attended and passed his examination at St. Louis. Krueger ordained him August 21st, 1881 in Great Bend. He also took over Tyler, or Summit Township, a place that Krueger had also organized during his extensive missionary trips. Shortly after his ordination, Kaler spread out into Richland County. He is responsible for Belford, the later St. John, in 1881, as well as Lidgerwood Emmanuel in 1882. And he would continue to serve these congregations until April 1885. Now, at this point, I do need to pause and talk about two other important events in the history of our district. The first of which is the ordination of a highly important man, a man you certainly know, Friedrich Pfotenhauer, born April 22nd, 1859, studied at St. Louis, and after passing his examination was ordained by Feter November 7th, 1880 in Odessa, Minnesota, meaning he's a classmate of Engels. Now, at this point, he's not immediately important to North Dakota. However, he soon will be. So keep him in mind as we move forward, especially in the next session. The other thing that we need to talk about real quick is the division of the Northwestern District. Because as the years went by, in the 5 years of that district, the number of congregations had exploded, especially in Minnesota. And so they sent a request to divide the district to the 18th Convention of the Synod, May 11th to the 21st, 1881, in Fort Wayne. That resolution passed, and so it was divided. Minnesota and the Dakotas separated to become what was now known as the Minnesota-Dakota District. That's the one that we're going to be following basically for the rest of our presentation. We'll be talking about North Dakota's time as the Minnesota-Dakota District. The remainder of the district was separated and was later renamed as the Wisconsin District, which would remain as a single district until 1916. Now, let me put this all into perspective here. The Minnesota-Dakota District at this time was made up of Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, and large parts of Canada. That was one district. And it's not even the biggest that it's going to be in the course of its history. And it will divide again in 1910 at the end of our presentation.
Could you say one more time where, when, and where Pfotenhauer was ordained? You say it was Feter?
Feter ordained him.
Feter ordained him. And where was it? Yeah.
November 7th, 1880 in Odessa, Minnesota. Okay, so for the last part of this presentation, then we need to go back north to Hillsboro. Because as we see in that same familiar pattern, Engels' field divided in 1882, and he called his successor to North Dakota. This man, Julius Frick. Born July 15th, 1861, he studied at St. Louis, and after passing his examination, he was ordained August 6th, 1882 in Emmanuel, Hillsboro. But interestingly, he was not ordained by Engel. Rather, he was ordained by Krueger. The reason why, I'm not really sure. They don't say. It could be because of Engel's poor health. Engel was constantly traveling, and I think it wore him out, so that he took a call to Fergus Falls and was installed there on February 10th, 1884, but he would enter into glory when he died, a young man of 30, on February 2nd, 1889. So whether that was the reason why Krueger ordained Frick instead of Engel, I'm not sure, but I think that might be the reason why. However, Frick very quickly turned his attention far to the north in Pembina County, the oldest and the most densely settled at the time county of North Dakota, because he wanted to reach the Germans there. He made contact with families near St. Thomas within 3 weeks of his ordination, so that he held his first service near St. Thomas in a home August 27th, 1882. And I have reason to believe that St. Paul was organized about 2 years later in 1884, a claim which I make based on comparing congregations and statistics and so forth. But anyway, Frick would go on to start all kinds of other places. He's responsible for Acton, the later Zion. He's responsible for Crystal, the later St. John, as well as 3 preaching stations, Osnabrück, Park River, and Adams. Now, I'm unclear in what order these all came into existence, but it seems clear that they all were in existence by the end of 1883. And maybe as a last note, as we kind of come to the end of this presentation, these last 3 preaching stations continued for some time. I think they finally went out of existence in the 20s or the 30s, but they never blossomed into organized congregations that whole time. They just didn't. And sometimes that's God's will, that a congregation only lasts for a short time or never grow very big. But we can still give thanks to him for the work that he did there. Because even though they're long gone, there's still a place where God met his people. And I know that I can't talk about every single place like this that has gone out of existence or that only existed for a short time, but I want these three to be an example of God's faithfulness to his people, even in long forgotten corners of North Dakota.